Hello there. Welcome to this stage. It's the third stage we've done. Just waiting on some more folks to shuffle in. I'm also trying to get the attention of some of our staff members, so we'll be starting up in just a bit here. But before we get started, this is going to be a bit more technical than the last couple of stages we've had. We're going to be talking about how some of the things behind the scenes work, what we do to make our station run, and we're also going to, for a large part of it, take sort of a general stance, take a look at what you might do to run a radio station, not just ours, not just the way that we do it, but if you're starting from nothing, where do you begin? Once again, if you're just coming in here, I'm just waiting on another one of my staff members to join, so they'll be around in just a moment. And I think,
Yeah, I'm here.
What's going on, Nano?
Slightly busy this morning, but it looks like I got back just in time. So let me get caught up with a couple things, but I'll be here. So give me a second.
Cool. All right. Well, we had some more folks that said they wanted to get pinged with a reminder in our server, and hopefully that's gone out. That's a bit of a new feature, I think, as far as Discord stages go, but we'll go ahead and get things started here. So welcome, everyone. So I am Lunar. Along with me is Nano, and we are a couple of the staff here on Gensokyo Radio. This is a Discord stage event, and we're going to be talking about how to run an internet radio station. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be sort of a more generalized talk. We're going to talk about all the way back to the basic stuff. What even is a radio station? Why would someone want to make one in this day and age? Or is it even still relevant? And if you are in fact interested, or it sounds like it's something that you might want to try out, how do you get started? What are some of the things that you need to make it work? And of course, part of the perspective of doing this talk is that we ourselves are an internet radio station. We've been doing this for the better part of, well, let's see, this is our 10-year anniversary from 2011 to 2021, but I guess technically it's like 10 and a half. Just trying to figure out if we're closer to 10 or 11 years. I'm not really sure, but we're somewhere in there. So we're doing this thing for a while, and hopefully we can draw on our experience to help point you in the right direction if this is actually something you're interested in and you want to try your hand out at this and go from there. All right. So first of all, before we really dive into the content, just want to go over the overview, a couple of things here, who we are, and then we'll dive right into the content here. So 10 plus years of experience, we'll dive into the tech aspects of our journey, talk about what we've learned along the way. And we do want to mention that we are excited to partner with Discord to showcase the still relatively new Discord Stages feature that rolled out in the not too distant past. Thank you to the folks at Discord for the opportunity. It's been pretty cool seeing how these work and interacting with our audience throughout the events. So thank you to those guys. So intros then, I am Lunar. I am the station manager. I do, honestly, a little bit of everything. I try to silo myself into one or two areas, but really, I do web development and sysadministration, and I ship products out. It's like, I do a little bit of everything. The best way to sum it up probably is if something breaks, I'm probably the one who ends up fixing it. Nano, what do you do here?
Well, I help out, and I guess I'm a sanity check of some sort as of late.
Yeah.
I do artwork because radios are an auditory means, but sometimes it's nice to have stuff to look at, so I help with that. Though you do a lot of the cool website visuals and whatnot, but I'm just kind of here along with the ride at this time, doing things. That's what I got.
Yeah, pretty much. A couple other folks that aren't with us this afternoon. We've got DMJ654, who is one of our radio personalities. One of the things we do at Gensokyo Radio is we do monthly live broadcasts. It's just called Gensokyo Radio Live. If you haven't tuned into any of those, we do have those shows available on our website as well as on pretty much every major podcast platform out there. You know, your Spotify and Apple Music and all that stuff, or Apple Podcast. What was that called? Something like that. But we're on a bunch of platforms out there. You can go find it out there if you're interested. We also have our last couple of Discord stage events up available on just our website for now. We'll probably get those out on sort of some of the major platforms in the not too distant future. DMJ654 is also, basically just one of the co-hosts on those programs. And then we also have our fourth staff member who isn't with us this afternoon, Zara. He is our library manager, basically helps to influence the music we play, source additional music, and just overall keep another ear out there to, what music is becoming available from some of the fan artists that our station plays. If you are new to our server or our station, just a real brief overview of what it is that we do so that you get a little bit more familiar with us. We're a 24/7 internet radio station, like Gensokyo Radio is, playing fan-made arrangements from a specific video game series. The Toho Project video game series is more popular in Japan, but there are fans all over the place, and so our station is able to reach out to folks in over 160 some countries. We have a couple studios in St. Paul, Minnesota, as well as Louisville, Kentucky, and it sounds fancier than it actually is. It's really just anywhere we can do those live programs is something we consider a studio. And if you're curious to learn more about who we are, what it is that we do specifically, our first Discord stage event kind of went over all of that. So for now, it's just the four of us, and there have been some other folks in the past that have helped us out along the way. Obviously, 10 years, people kind of come and go, but that's how it goes. So let's dive into this. We're going to, again, I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but we're going to start pretty much at the basics. What is a radio station? Now, this seems really kind of elementary. It's like, really? People don't know what a radio station is? Believe it or not. I can tell you this because folks who have reviewed our mobile app are like, I can't play music on demand. Why can't I hit the song and nothing happens? It's like, there's a play button, there's a stop button. It's super simple. What is a radio station? Now, traditionally, a radio station broadcasts or transmits audio via radio waves over the air with the intent that said audio will reach a wide audience. Terrestrial or ground-based radio stations have towers that emit radio waves, which carry audio some long distance. The distance varies depending on the tower and the amount of power it has and such. But the idea is that those signals can be picked up by a receiver, like a listener. It could be in a car radio or a boombox or what have you. Now, audio is transmitted by these radio waves using a couple of primary methods. You're probably already familiar with them. There's frequency modulation, or FM, and amplitude modulation, or AM. And kind of the best way to, I don't know if it's the best way, a way to describe what those things are is if you imagine a sine wave, you kind of got your basic rounded wave. It's a curved oscillating wave. FM radio changes its signal by increasing or decreasing the number of times that this wave moves inside of some unit of time. You modulate the frequency of the wave in a given time span, that is frequency modulation, as the name implies. Amplitude modulation, or AM radio, changes its amplitude, that is the height of the wave, while the wave holds the same frequency over time. So you can kind of think of it like if you were, like I'm recording on Audacity right now because we do end up recording these and making them available after the fact. As I'm recording this, the level, when I speak, the wave is big, and when I'm not speaking, the wave is basically flat. That's kind of what AM looks like if you were to plot it on an oscilloscope over time. And those are basically just a couple different ways that the data gets transmitted over a wave. It's a pretty basic explanation, but because of how FM transmits its radio signal, also has generally higher fidelity. Obviously, if you've listened to both FM and AM before, you'll know that FM has stereo. It usually sounds better. It's usually used for things like music because it's able to, it just sounds higher quality. And there's some other fancier things that's happening in an FM signal that I'm sort of glossing over. This is a really basic explanation of how it works. But you can kind of think of that like those waves are occupying sort of this larger range or width of frequencies, kind of centered on a particular frequency. You've got your 99.7 or your 101.3 or, those frequencies. That's kind of what it centers on when you tune into an FM radio station. So it's got sort of this wider area or range. It's often used for music because it's higher quality, whereas AM is generally relegated to mono audio, and it often is more suitable for things like news radio or talk or sports or other non-music content. It's still useful. I think most car radios still have both FM and AM, and that's because there's a bunch of good content out there. It's not that one is better than the other outright. It's just that they have their own use cases, things that they're more appropriate for. So we then turn to what is an internet radio station. Well, the idea is pretty similar, except you're not transmitting over the air, you're transmitting over the internet. An internet radio station broadcasts audio via the internet as opposed to airborne radio waves. So this is generally accomplished through the use of software, and there are a bunch of options out there, and this can potentially be listened to anywhere in the world and internet connections available, as opposed to a sort of localized area where those radio waves from a terrestrial radio station can reach out to. Those have limited range versus an internet radio station, whereas it's potentially worldwide, which is really neat. Now, I talked about sort of the audio fidelity with terrestrial radio stations because it's kind of got an analog to internet radio. So audio fidelity is affected not by the type of the transmission, it's not FM or AM, but rather internet radio stations are affected by the audio bit rate that they broadcast or transmit in. Like I mentioned, similar to AM or FM radio, a low bit rate stream can be good for things like broadcasting talk, content, sports, news, that kind of thing. And your higher bitrate streams are more appropriate for things that contain music. And it's the perceived quality of a particular stream is generally dependent on the audio compression that is used for that broadcast. So one of the really common bit rates that you'll find out there is 128 kilobits per second for an MP3 stream. Now that's all right. I mean, there's obviously, the higher that number goes, the better quality it is generally with sort of diminishing returns. But if you use a different audio codec, you can actually accomplish similar qualities using even lower bit rates. You can go all the way, like 64 kilobits per second. But if you use MP3 for that, it's probably not going to sound that great. But you can use other codecs such as AAC, you can use Opus, and those just have a different way of compressing the audio that the end result ends up sounding actually not that bad. Probably better than you'd expect. And that's a great way to save on bandwidth for mobile devices if people are tuned in that way, and other things, just other lower bitrate listeners. So with all that out there, why would someone even want to make an internet radio station? We're kind of in the age where everything's digital. Everyone's got their own device. Folks are running websites. On-demand content is out there now, super popular. So is this even still relevant? I pulled some numbers, and we can kind of go through some of those. Starting at looking, again, at terrestrial radio stations, but we'll also throw satellite radio in there as well, because that's been a thing that's happened over within the last 20 years or so. So terrestrial radio stations, one of the things that makes them a little bit more complicated is that there is additional red tape to get through before you even get on the air. You have your startup and operating costs that can also be really expensive. You've got to be able to transmit a signal far enough for people relatively far away to be able to listen to you. And if you can't afford that, or you can't afford to power the thing to transmit, or you can't afford the equipment to run, it's all of it's very like brick and mortar. It's a physical radio station when you're talking about terrestrial radio, because that tower has to go somewhere. You have to be able to broadcast somehow. Your equipment doesn't have to be super fancy in terms of generating the audio, but in order to get it out there at all, you've got to have that. And that's to say nothing of any, FCC regulations that you'll run into in the US, other restrictions on, is there even enough open space in the existing FM radio or AM radio space to put a new radio station in if you wanted to run something like that. So it's just really complicated, generally speaking. Then we have satellite radio, which has always been kind of this niche thing, but it's filled in a gap in coverage. It's really useful for folks who end up traveling a lot. You think semi-truck drivers use satellite radio quite a bit, and that kind of thing. And satellite radio is sort of this, it was in the early 2000s where, the satellites went up. We had Sirius and XM, who eventually merged later on. Those are the two options you have. I think now there's just the one. And it turns out that a lot of the FCC restrictions and red tape and things like that you'd have to go through otherwise, satellite radio ends up going around quite a bit of that. Now, obviously, we're talking barrier to entry. Launching satellites is not really something that the layperson wants to do. You'd probably want to appeal to Sirius XM or something and say, hey, I've got this idea for a program. And, maybe that's an option, but honestly, they kind of do, they have their own set of programs, they run their own thing. That's not really something that I think most people would be trying to get into. And then there's kind of this perception that terrestrial radio stations have been falling out of favor since the advent of satellite radio in 2003, and then of course the explosion of digital media alternatives via just computers and mobile devices and things from the mid 2000s and 2010s onwards. But we have some numbers to back up exactly, is it actually falling out of favor, and if so, by how much? Terrestrial radio station audiences have actually been slowly waning over time. Some stats from Nielsen Media Research would suggest this. If we go back to 2010, I guess most of these surveys look at listenership of Americans, just because it's fairly well documented demographic over time. There's plenty of people who are interested in what Americans are listening to, so that's kind of the context of all these numbers. But if we go back to 2010, about 92% of Americans said they were listening to some terrestrial radio station, or they had listened to it sometime in the last week. Go back 5 years later, in 2015, about 91%. 2019, 89%. And in 2020, it drops quite a bit to 83%. And some of the research suggests that that's proof that it's falling out of favor. And I think I'd like to raise my hand and say, maybe that's because we had a pandemic and there were fewer people driving, so fewer people were listening to the radio in their cars, and those who were working from home maybe tuned into more digital channels. That's kind of my suspicion, and hopefully folks might echo that opinion, but that's kind of what I think ended up happening. I wouldn't be surprised if, say, this year or next year, we end up seeing that number go back up a little bit as people drive a bit more. But then we got, your digital media and your internet radio stations. So how have these trended over time? If we look over the last decade, digital media trends have driven listeners to go digital, but this trend of people starting internet radio stations actually began in the 1990s. So it's been around for quite a while. Go back all the way to 1999. We can look at how many people even had internet back then. 50% of Americans had internet in 1999. That seems ridiculous now, given that, most of us have smartphones in our pocket. But that's how things were back then. The dark ages, if you will. I don't know. Then in 2009, that went up to 85% of people had internet, according to radiosurvivor.com. College radio stations began streaming internet radio in the 1990s, with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Georgia Tech University being the first couple of colleges to start doing that. And later on, we had other online broadcasting efforts that came in the form of Broadcast.com, which was later acquired by Yahoo, Spinner, which was later acquired by AOL, and others. Even, one of the still relatively popular platform, SHOUTcast, is still out there. It was originally an AOL thing, is now currently acquired by Radionomy, but we'll talk a little bit more about those later in just a bit here. And then in the year 2000, we had Arbitron and Edison Media Research reporting 13% of Americans were listening to internet radio stations in 1999, which is a fairly high number considering how many people had internet back then. 20% of Americans were listening to in 2000, and then something like over 40% of Americans were listening in 2003. Now, obviously, more people had internet during that time, but of those who had internet, that's the fraction of people who had listened to an internet radio station at some point in the last month when people were surveyed. There's also the trend of podcasts. I think a lot of people are familiar with podcasts. People listen to podcasts all the time these days. How did that end up trending? We can go back to 2008. Again, it's from Edison Research and Written Digital. 9% of Americans in 2008 listened to a podcast in the past month when they were surveyed. You go all the way to 2020, and that's jumped to 37%. 2021, that's 41%. So it is definitely, podcasts have been, they were relatively popular before. It's been trending upward ever since. What is it? I'm pretty sure we call them podcasts in the first place because people would commonly, download shows and listen to them on their iPod or something, right? Like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like that's kind of how I remember it now.
The man, it's hard to think that was an era
Yeah,
back when iPods were actually not phones.
yeah, that's true. And then online radio itself, the adoption of online radio has increased over the last decade as well. If we go back again to about 2008, so the same sort of era that I was looking at the podcast, about 21% of Americans reported listening in the last month. That continues to trend upward. In 2010, we had 27%. 2012, it was 39%. 2014, 47%. We go all the way up to 2021, the current year, 68% of people surveyed said that at some point in the last month, they'd listened to an internet radio station. So those have also been trending upward. In fact, for the people surveyed, apparently that's still quite a bit more out there than podcasts. But yeah, I mean, obviously they're both popular in their own ways. It's just that I guess the point here is that if you had any doubts about is internet radio even relevant anymore, given we have all this on-demand media and podcasts are out there and all that stuff, well, the answer is yes. People listen to internet radio all the time, and it's a pretty big chunk of the population. So if I haven't convinced you yet, we can look at some of the advantages and disadvantages over what's currently out there. We've got internet radio versus podcasts and on-demand content. This is a direct, compare and contrast kind of thing. So if we look at internet radio, what can internet radio do? Like, what are some of its benefits? Well, for one, it can appeal to a broader audience with a wider demographic. So think of it this way. Your audience might tune into a radio station and they might hear something that they wouldn't normally listen to by choice. Another way to think of this is think of, if you are subscribed to someone on YouTube or you follow someone on Twitch, maybe you tune into them, but you might not necessarily be super interested in whatever game they're playing or whatever content they're producing, but you still tune into them because it's someone you follow. It's kind of like that with an internet radio station. Maybe it plays mostly things that you're interested in, but every now and then it plays something that maybe you wouldn't listen to by choice. So it broadens the audience with whatever you're playing, just sort of as an effect of that. Internet radio stations also allow folks to engage with an audience in real time. It's, again, kind of similar to the live streaming narrative on Twitch or YouTube or whatever platform out there. Folks can interact with you in the comment section. Not quite unlike what this forum is, Discord stages. If we had a chat channel somewhere, it's something that we could interact with folks in real time. It's something that we do with our live program on the radio station. And that's just, again, we're able to engage with folks. And then broadcasts are ephemeral, which means that they only last for a short time. And when an announcement goes up saying, we're doing a live broadcast at this time on this day, it can sort of create a sense of urgency. You're encouraging folks to listen now because they might not be able to listen later. And emphasis on might not be able to. I'll get to that in a second. Finally, one of the drawbacks is that a radio broadcast is live and it can't be edited after audio has been broadcast. So we kind of make a joke of this every now and then during our live broadcasts on Gensokyo Radio. It's live, so if we mess up on something, we can't really take it back. It's like me talking to you right now. This isn't pre-recorded. You're actually hearing my voice probably milliseconds after I said it in real time. And then we have podcasts and on-demand. So what are some of the benefits of those against some of these other mediums? A podcast can be directed at a more niche audience. So if you're a listener of a podcast, you're probably looking for something that interests you specifically. You can click on a podcast, you can read what it's about, and kind of go from there. But you sort of have this setup where you're only listening to things that you've decided you're interested in. Whereas with a radio station, that, again, kind of might be the case most of the time, but you might catch things that maybe you wouldn't select by choice. Podcasts are pre-recorded. They can be edited after recording and before publishing. And they're what is called evergreen, which basically means it lasts for a long time. Listeners can discover content over time because it's kind of just always up there. And websites and blogs and whoever else can direct their readers or viewers to your program. But one of the drawbacks, like I mentioned before, is that podcasts are a one-way method of communication. You are speaking to an audience that will at some point tune into you. It's not in real time, but that's the way it works. Like I mentioned before, the trend to merge these mediums has kind of been around for years. I said, it's you might not be able to listen to broadcasts later, but more and more shows have been kind of doing this thing where they'll do a broadcast and they'll record it, and so they'll have that recording and they'll later publish that recording as a podcast. And it's not just us at Gensokyo Radio who've been doing this for some time. There's other multiple shows on well-known platforms like NPR, BBC Radio, as well as several other traditional radio shows have published the recorded versions of their shows as podcasts. It's just another way to sort of branch out and capture more of an audience that way. So we're talking about internet radio, podcasts, on-demand stuff, but what about other services like Spotify? Super popular. A lot of folks use it. Pandora's out there. There's other services that are kind of like that. I guess YouTube Music would be in there too. And there are pros and cons of those as well, of course. When you use a service like that, it might involve selecting or setting up some sort of queue, or maybe the system sort of quote unquote learns what your preferences are over time. But one of the neat things about those platforms is it's flexible. If you maybe aren't super into what the system has decided is going to play for you, you can go in and change it up. So radio stations don't have as much flexibility, but they are very simple to operate in comparison. You literally just tune in and you listen. That's it. You hit a button, you go. You turn the dial, and there's the audio. There's no thinking about it after that point. You just have it on. And what's kind of interesting is if we look at Spotify, they're actively dabbling in all three of these categories. They've got your on-demand music, sort of song by song, trying to figure out what it is that you like as a listener. But they also have a whole podcast platform, which, we have something out there on their platform, as well as these other radio stations where it's meant to be, you tune in and it's just the same thing and you don't have to think about it. So they're doing all three of these things, which is interesting in its own way, but it's also sort of a testament that all mediums that we've been talking about are still widely utilized. A lot of this information about advantages and disadvantages over present-day on-demand services is from radio.co. Okay, so enough about all that. If you're actually here and you've heard the numbers and you're like, okay, well, that's great. I'm still interested. How do I get started? How do I actually do this thing? So there's going to be kind of an analog here. I'm going to talk about some of the things that you need, some of the things that you can do with certain resources. If you only have so much bandwidth, what can you do with that? What software do you need? There's free and paid solutions out there and stuff like that. There's stuff where it requires a lot of technical info or a lot of technical knowledge, stuff that you kind of just start and you give it music and it kind of just goes. So the level of difficulty is variable, and the level of experience or time that you need to spend learning this stuff is also quite variable. So with that said, one of the things that you need is a willingness to learn. If you're stepping into this space and you haven't been in here before, if you've never tried running your own station or doing your own live stream on a streaming platform or anything like that, there's gonna be a bunch of stuff to learn. And that's really just have an open mind, have a willingness to learn. It's fairly important. You're gonna need a computer, obviously. It can be Windows or Mac or Linux based, whatever you got really. There's stuff out there for every platform, and that needs to be something that you can keep on for as long as your station operates, whether that's at certain times of the day, on certain days, maybe it's during certain specific events, or maybe it's all the time, 24/7 like our radio station is. Then you're also going to need an internet connection with sufficient upload bandwidth. Now this is pretty important because that's the way that people tune in. So if you don't have sufficient upload bandwidth at wherever you've decided to broadcast from, you're going to run into problems. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then, of course, if you've got a station, you need content to be played. You need something that's actually going to be interesting, something that's going to hold people's attention, whether that's playing music that you decide you want to play, or running your own talk show, or doing your own newscast, or maybe you cover sports, or maybe you want to talk about religion, or maybe you got in a certain stance on politics, whatever it is, running your own radio station is a way to sort of make your own platform. And that's kind of unique in this day and age where a lot of people turn to existing platforms like YouTube or Twitch or whatever is out there. There's a ton of different options out there, but running your own station is a way to sort of just be your own operator, in a way of speaking. That's more or less true depending on if you use a pre-made solution or if you kind of spin up your own thing. But that said, those are the most basic requirements to get something started. I mentioned bandwidth. Bandwidth's pretty important to an internet radio station for what should be obvious reasons, but how much bandwidth you actually need depends on what you actually want to do with your radio station. And what you want to do with your radio station will help to drive your bandwidth requirements. So this depends on a couple of different factors. Two main factors: your size of the audience, how many people are actually listening, and the bit rate or bit rates, depending on what it is that you're broadcasting, how high of quality does that need to be. And to a certain extent, that can also be the format that you're broadcasting in. MP3 is really popular for, it's just kind of the de facto standard, but there's other codecs out there that are a bit more efficient, but might not be as compatible with devices out there. So to give some examples, when we're talking about bit rates, they're measured in kilobits per second or kbps. And a couple of examples, if you've got, sort of your average concurrent user base, how many people are listening in a given amount of time on average. If you even have, we're going to start real low numbers here. Obviously, I think people aspire to be much larger than this, but say that your radio station has 5 people listening and you're streaming an audio stream at 128 kbps. It's about 7 gigabytes per day that you're spending on those 5 listeners, or over the course of a month, that ends up being about 210 gigabytes. That is already kind of a lot of bandwidth for just uploading audio all the time. And this is assuming a 24/7 kind of thing. Obviously, if you're covering, say that you've got like a high school or a college event that you're covering, and it's only kind of happening at that moment, then obviously you're going to be able to have more listeners, use less bandwidth over time. But if you say you have a lot more listeners listening at that one time, you might need more bandwidth to be able to push out to people. So we can look at it from an upload limit perspective. Say you've got 5 megabit upload. Again, we're starting with relatively low numbers here. You can have roughly 35 listeners listening to a 128 kilobit per second stream. That would end up being in the ballpark of about 1,500 gigabytes per month. So that's something you kind of have to be careful about. Is if, this quickly gets into the realm of probably shouldn't do this from home. Probably need something a little beefier than that in terms of bandwidth. But if we can extrapolate this further and say you've got a 25 megabit upload, you'd be able to support about 175 listeners at the same bit rate. But again, that's going to be dangerously, that's quite a bit up there in terms of bandwidth usage. You got about 7,400 gigabytes per month, roughly. And if you want to make your stream higher quality, say we can double the bitrate to 256 kbps, you're going to be able to support 88 listeners on a 25 megabit upload limit. So just some things to think about. If you were thinking that, hey, this is something I can run from home, maybe if you're not expecting too many listeners, but if you're expecting, more than 20 or 50 or 100 or several hundred or several thousand, you're definitely going to want to look at something that's either hosted by a provider of some sort or self-hosted in some way, shape, or form. When it comes to actually making the station, say you've got a computer and you've got enough bandwidth, you're like, okay, to actually get started, or even just to play around with some of this stuff, what is out there? How do I get started? What software is there available to make this happen? And I've kind of broken this down into things that you want to do and what software can do that thing. So it's very core. You want to be able to create some sort of audio signal. Think you play music on your computer, it streams out of the stereo output on your computer, maybe, and that goes to your headphones. That's creating an audio signal. You want to take that signal and you want to broadcast it out to folks. How do you do that? Here are a few different ways. With the music example, Say you're running a media player. It could be Winamp, VLC, FooBar. It could be whatever your favorite media player out there is. And if your computer has a stereo mix, you can grab the signal from stereo mix and you can, that's your audio signal basically. If your computer or your audio driver doesn't have stereo mix, you can use virtual audio cable. It's pretty popular with folks. That is basically used for routing different input and output devices together where existing physical inputs and outputs may not be present or sufficient for some reason. So the example here is that you could take the output from a media player and output that to a virtual output interface. So it doesn't have to go out of the stereo out in your computer. It can just go to this sort of virtual output, and that's kind of just where it lives. So it doesn't come out of your headphones unless you want it to at that point. But you can take that and you can pick it up by some separate piece of software which picks up that audio signal from the virtual input and uses that for your broadcast material. That's one way you can do that. If you're looking for maybe a fancier way to produce the audio content itself, there are many, many different options out there. We're not talking like basic media players like FooBar or VLC, but there are things out there like, for example, you could use software like Virtual DJ. It's more of a turntable style audio program that a lot of live DJs use out there in combination with their turntables, but there's some other stuff out there that does something very similar to that, but that's another way to sort of have better control over the start and stop time of songs, the way that they transition, any effects that you might want to apply, that kind of thing. Of course, running something like that's limited kind of because you have to be there in person, but if you're not doing this 24/7, say you're doing it for an event, that is one option that you have. If you're a Mac user, there's a couple different options out there. There's Audio Hijack for Mac as well as Loopback. These both have flows that are pretty similar to virtual audio cable that I mentioned earlier, where you can take some sort of source like iTunes or a USB microphone or Discord or Skype or whatever program on your computer is generating some sort of audio, and you can direct that through this program to a particular output channel, and that generates the signal, which can again be picked up by a different program and broadcast to your broadcast server. If you don't want to do any of that, or maybe you are a bit more technical and you just want to run all of this on a server out there, like a Linux machine, that this is kind of the way that we did it for 10 years or so, but you can use a transcoder of some sorts. For the first 10 years of our radio station, we were largely based on SHOUTcast. Present day, we're Icecast based, actively transitioning to that. But the transcoder for SHOUTcast is long been deprecated, but it was the go-to option for SHOUTcast streaming, and it pairs pretty well with SHOUTcast server software. So that is an option out there, even though it is old, it still technically works. Ask me how I know. All right, so you've got an audio signal and you want to send it someplace. So how do you do that? There's a couple ways that I've noted down. There's probably more than this, but with SHOUTcast, you've got your option of installing Winamp, and there's a plugin for SHOUTcast. It's just the SHOUTcast DSP plugin, the digital signal processor plugin. That would basically take whatever output from Winamp, if you just want to use that as your media player, and you want to take the audio that comes from that and pipe it out to your broadcast server, or it can also use any input devices that you have. So a microphone in, or a virtual microphone in if you've got virtual audio cable running, that kind of thing. So that's one way to do it. That plugin has been used for the majority of our live shows that we've done broadcasting for. But when we transitioned to using Icecast, we also switched up the software that we use to broadcast to our server. We use a software called Broadcast Using This Tool, or just BUTT, B-U-T-T, stands for Broadcast Using This Tool. If DMJ were here, he'd poke fun at me for that, but it's actually a quite useful program, and it can broadcast to both SHOUTcast and Icecast-based servers. You've got a variety of other audio side software out there. Some of these are sort of pre-made solutions. Some of them are all-in-one solutions. I think not all of these are free. Some of them have some sort of payment model for the software, but you've got software like Radio Boss, Xcast Pro, Sam Broadcaster's been out there for many, many years. Mix with 3X's, Serato DJ, SentovaCast, AzuraCast, Radio.co has their web-based all-in-one solution. Those are just some options that you have out there, especially if you're not as technically inclined and maybe you don't want to really get your hands dirty with programming and code and that kind of thing. That, you know, there are definitely options out there like Radio.co, or Radionomy has a solution where you can host your material on their servers, and obviously your bandwidth and your listeners are limited, but it's a decent way to get started if you're just kind of looking to try it out. I spent a lot of time talking about, you know, how do you generate an audio signal? You know, play music in a media player, have it go to some sort of output, but how do you take that output and do something with it? So the two main players in the space for what your broadcast server is, I've been mentioning this throughout, but I haven't, you know, this is where you get to taking that signal and pushing it out to a server someplace. This is, if you're kind of doing this yourself, you've got a couple different options. You got SHOUTcast, you got Icecast, and there's probably other stuff out there, but these are two of the biggest players in the space. SHOUTcast, which is something that our radio station has used for many years, is more of a proprietary solution, but it's very popular. It's relatively easy to get started. There's, especially with Radionomy and how they have things set up, if you wanted to just get started with running your own server, that is, you know, something you can do as well. This was formerly owned by Nullsoft and AOL, is now currently owned by Radionomy, like I've been mentioning. It has free and paid tiers with self-hosted and also an option where they host the stuff. So I kind of went over a lot of this already. And they also have their own sort of what they call yellow pages, or a public listing. So if you want to make a station and you want it to be listed somewhere so that people can browse a library, then that is something that they offer. Then there's Icecast, which is more of an open source solution. People kind of praise it for that alone, kind of. But this is somewhat similar to SHOUTcast. Services that people offer out there are generally third-party services. You know, it's not like Radionomy has SHOUTcast and offers services based on it. Icecast doesn't quite do that, but there are plenty of providers out there that will help you make your own Icecast-based radio station if that's something you're interested in. So if you wanted to do this stuff on your own, there's software for both SHOUTcast and Icecast that runs. I know SHOUTcast has stuff. Actually, both of these have software that works with both Windows as well as Linux. For our solution, we have been running a Linux server in a data center, and primarily because it has enough bandwidth to handle the scale of listeners that our station currently has. And you kind of go from there, really. It's once you have that, your audio signal, wherever that comes from, you know, whether it's something that you're producing at your computer locally and then sending that one stream out to your broadcast server, or you've got some sort of server-side transcoder, like I mentioned with SHOUTcast's transcoder program. That's, again, old, but still works. You have some options. So with SHOUTcast, for a really long time, we used that transcoder, and basically the way that works is it's its own program that reads from a playlist file that is generated. Either you can have it on shuffle, you can read from a specific file or files at different points of the day. You can schedule things over time, and you can also allow radio DJs to connect to it for, say, something like a live show, like the ones that we've done over time. So you've got that. The transcoder basically generates that audio signal so that you don't have to do that at your computer. The server takes care of that. Then it sends it directly to, say, SHOUTcast server, software that can run on the same machine, and that's ends up creating an endpoint. Basically, you tell SHOUTcast's server software to generate a specific bitrate stream on a specific port on your server, and then people are able to connect to it that way. You can do certain other things like proxy that port to be a URL that looks a little bit nicer. So like in our case, instead of being a port, we say, you know, people can go to stream.gensokyo.net/1, and that's the endpoint for our 128 kbps MP3 stream. Or at least it was when we were using SHOUTcast. It still is for Icecast. Icecast is pretty similar, except it doesn't, I guess Icecast has a few options for being able to generate that audio signal in the first place. But in our case, we just use the server portion of that Icecast software, where it's important because that's the thing that people actually connect to listen to your radio station. There's other server-side software that can help take an audio signal and do more with it. So say, for example, you've got an audio signal that you want to send to a server, and you also want your station to be available in multiple bit rates. Or maybe you want some safety measure to, like, say if you are creating the source, like the audio at home, and maybe you don't have a very good connection, so you want to prevent the station from disconnecting all the time or whatever. You can have something sit in the middle between your audio source and the broadcast server. And one of the things that we've found that works pretty well for that is a server software called Liquidsoap. Kind of a strange name, but it's actually super useful. So it can take that one audio signal that, say, you're sending, say that you're sending a 320 kilobit per second stream to the server, but in the end, you want your listeners to be able to listen to a 128 kbps stream, a 256 kbps stream. Maybe you want to throw in a 64-bit AAC stream in there or something. Liquidsoap can take that one signal, break it out into different bit rates, and then push it to your Icecast or SHOUTcast server. And that's really useful because if you're broadcasting, if you're creating that audio source from one location and you don't want to run multiple streams from where you are because it ends up taking more bandwidth over time or something, then that's one way to do it. It's actually really useful. And it does require a little bit of not really coding or programming. I mean, it does use like a sort of specific language to say, hey, I want to do this, but it's very like plain text. It takes a really complicated process and boils it down to like single lines of code. So it's really, really useful that way. All right. So we want to talk about a couple things. I'll skip over the hardware segment here, but basically for hardware, you have a few different options. You can run things on a desktop. You can have things all hosted on a server, like a VPS, a virtual private server, which is cheaper than running a dedicated server and will do most of what you're looking for probably in a radio station. You also have the benefit of these being hosted in data centers, which have more bandwidth than you probably do. So those are really good options for radio stations if you're trying to get something spun up on your own. And then I do want to just mention real quick content. So like, obviously, if you're creating a talk-based station or you're streaming sports or you're doing your own thing, that's one thing. But say you want to stream music. Well, it's important to remember that not all music is just music that you can take and start streaming, and that's it. That's just not how it works. For a lot of mainstream music out there, music that, if you turn on your FM radio station, what's playing, it's probably something that is covered under some sort of license. So there are different licenses for music in the US and in Europe and in other countries. But in the US, the three large blanket licensing groups are ASCAP, BMI, and SCSAC. And a blanket license to be able to play some of the mainstream music out there ranges. It ranges wildly from hundreds to millions of dollars, depending on the effective duration of the blanket license, what the coverage area of the station is, how many people are usually listening, how frequently you play music that's covered by the blanket license, and so on. So it's there is no one set price for that kind of thing. It depends on whatever your specific case is. And then I covered this a little bit more in our first Discord stage event, but indie is different in a way because it's usually not bound by a commercial license, but you do still have the element of copyright. Whoever makes the music always has the copyright unless they specifically relinquish it for whatever reason. So it's important to remember that if an artist doesn't want you to play their material, they can say no at any time. So just putting that out there. And again, there's in our specific case with our station, there's more to it than that, but I'm literally just trying to get through the rest of this. So people, if you have any questions out there, and I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff I'm kind of skipping over or simplifying. We'll have some time for questions at the end of this. So if we look at Gensokyo Radio, what our path has been using both SHOUTcast and Icecast based solutions. We go back to 2011 when Gensokyo Radio started. The founder of the station used a SHOUTcast based service. It's if you use a service, they basically pretty much do everything for you. In this case, this service, I don't remember the name of it because it was years ago, but a lot of them out there provide a web interface that you can use. You can upload your music through that web interface. You can decide what your playlist is, or if you just want to put it on shuffle or what have you, and things like that. Services are going to be different across the board, but that's kind of the general idea, is that it simplifies it for you, the station owner or operator, to be able to do some of that stuff without having some of more of the technical knowledge. But of course, if you go with something like that, it does limit your ability to customize your station in a lot of cases. So when I got involved in December 2011, after he decided to shut it down for a little bit because he had other things going on, and so I decided, hey, I'm going to try my hand at this and we'll see what happens. So what I ended up doing was I spun up a local SHOUTcast server on my computer at home. So the playlist and the transcoder and the server were all in one machine. And we quickly found that, hey, I don't have enough bandwidth to handle all the people that want to connect to this thing. So that lasted for about a month. And then we ended up switching over to a Linux-based server machine hosted in a data center in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that was back in 2012. So from 2012 all the way up until just earlier this year, we used a combination of SHOUTcast's transcoder and server software that played from a generated playlist of files that were hosted on the server machine itself. Over those 10 years, we transitioned from server to server as our bandwidth requirements and our space requirements changed, and the popularity of our service changed. And so, but for the majority of time, our station has been hosted on some sort of Linux-based server. I think it's also important to note that the music that we had on this server was normalized, which basically means you want to take the relative loudness of a song and of a collection of songs, in this case our library of songs that we had on the station, and you want to normalize it in a way such that one song isn't sufficiently louder than another one. I think very early on we had some of our listeners say, I'll be listening to this orchestral song that's on, and it's relatively quiet. And then like the song right after that will be some sort of like heavier metal song or something that would be a lot louder, and they'd have to physically reach over to their volume dial and adjust it or whatever. So normalizing the music will help to sort of diminish some of that variance if you have a library that pulls from various albums and such. And then just earlier this year, actually for the last couple months, we've been dealing with the transition to an Icecast based system. So this still outputs from a media player, basically. We don't have the SHOUTcast transcoder anymore, so we need a way to generate that audio source that I talked about kind of near the beginning. So we have a specific media player program that does some other fancy stuff that's relevant to radio stations. That generates our audio signal. We then have the program, broadcast using this tool, or BUT, pick up that signal and it sends it to our Icecast server. And then on the server side, we have Liquidsoap take that one signal and it splits it out into 3 additional streams. So we have our 128 MP3, we have our 256 MP3, and we have a 64-bit opus. And that's the complement of streams that's currently available on our station. Liquidsoap generates those and then pushes those back to Icecast, which then makes it available to all of our listeners. That's how people listen. There's some other elements here. I know that we're pretty much at the end of the hour here, but I'm going to wrap this up. What I'm talking about, we'll have as much time for questions as we need, and that'll pretty much be it. But with the radio station, I didn't talk so much about some of the external stuff like websites or mobile applications or things like that. If you are just looking to get started doing something with internet radio, I think up to this point you've got a good foundation to sort of get started on. But if you want a way to be able to direct listeners to a specific website, how do you get people to listen? Websites or mobile apps are obviously popular these days. That's a whole nother talk, to be quite frank. But our website uses either Apache or Nginx. We've used both in the past. We have a database to be able to hold information about our songs and where they are. We have a rating system on our site, so in order for people to rate songs, we have to know what song they wanted to rate. And then, of course, our database has to record what they rated, so that has to go somewhere and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's more to it than that. We're getting quickly into the realm of web development, and that's not really what this talk is about. But it is interesting to note that both SHOUTcast and Icecast have an API, or an application programming interface, that gives you some additional information about things like what song is currently playing, or what's coming up next, or what's the song history, or who's currently listening, and all that stuff. That's very useful information to have for a radio station. If you're interested in knowing how many people have listened over time, you can sort of log some of that information. You can log what songs have played over time and that kind of thing. But again, this is more web development. It's just useful to know if that's something you're interested in. It does have endpoints for that information that you can access and get that useful information. I guess towards the end here, we do have a mobile app, but it took us a long time to get that going. And that's just because, A, developing a mobile application is really difficult. If you want to get someone else to do it for you, it's either going to not be very good or be very, very expensive. So we made one ourselves, which basically for Android involves learning how to apply the Java programming language to the Android framework. Again, this is outside the realm of like radio station stuff, but in terms of being able to support your radio station, it might be useful to know that if you want to make an Android app, you're probably going to want to know a little bit of either Java or Kotlin. Those are both programming languages. And if you want to develop for iOS, you're probably going to want to know the Swift programming language. So that is out there for anyone who is interested in knowing how do you direct more people to listen to your station? Where do you even begin? And obviously there's more to talk about those specific topics that we're unfortunately not going to cover in this time block. But in terms of the foundational internet radio station things, there's a lot there to digest, and that's pretty much it. So in summary, there are kind of three phases to how GR has ended up doing what we've done for the last 10 years. In the very beginning, we had a pre-made solution. Our website was WordPress, which is another sort of pre-made thing. It's pretty easy to get up there and deploy. And then for the 10 years or so, we used a combination of SHOUTcast and our own custom stuff, web development, and eventually we got a mobile app out there. These days we work with Icecast. Our audio source is not on the same machine, but it's external, so it's a little bit more complex, but it also allows us to have more control and customizability on our station. So there's a lot out there, and I'm 100% sure that there is stuff that I, again, either glossed over or summarized, or things that folks might want us to cover more. So it's going to be it for my bit here. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a little bit, but I also want to remind people that this event is being recorded. We do make these available after the fact on our website, and we are also only accepting raised hands from folks who have been verified through our member process. So that said, I'm going to open it up to folks. If you are new to Discord stages, as I'm sure many of us are, there is a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen if you're tuned into this, and we can go from there. And once again, if you don't have the member role, you will not be able to join us. We won't be able to call on you. So make sure that you're a verified member before raising your hand. What do you think, Nano? I know it was a mouthful. It's not like talking about the technical side of things isn't the easiest thing to do, but I know there's a lot there. It probably just washed over a bunch of people, but
I mean that kind of happens because it's hard to visualize the different components, how they interact, but also why they interact, right? Because like there's like you talked about like how you need upload, but you also need you need the software to deliver the broadcast, and you need to have the bandwidth, the infrastructure bandwidth to be able to connect to all the users, and you also need the processing power to do whatever you need to do the streaming. There's I mean, I just kind of taped like 3 different points that were strewn across the last like 35 minutes together. But yeah, it's one of those things that like if there's any technical questions, narrow them down to like a specific point, be easier to answer. But there's also like low resolution explanations for how things work as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So again, we are open to questions if you want to raise your hand on Discord. And if you're still thinking of a question, I wanted to go over something that Radio France does. This was something that popped up in my research on this topic. So Radio France uses a combination of Icecast and Liquidsoap, the technologies that we are now using on our station. But there is a significant difference in scale because Radio France runs on 6 national channels. They have 47 local channels, 23 music web radios. They serve about 2 million listeners per day, and there are generally always about 200,000 simultaneous listeners listening to their stuff. So if you had any doubts about sort of the scalability of the solution, it is massively scalable. Icecast is just kind of crazy in that way. So they use a combination of Icecast and Liquidsoap, and they have this whole flow where they use like a combination of Amazon Web Services, ends up pushing it out to their Icecast server, and then they have multiple servers that people can connect to, because obviously having that many listeners all connect to one singular machine is not just not going to happen. You need multiple servers that are load balanced and all that stuff to make a system like that work. But it's all based on the same foundational software that we were just talking about, Icecast and Liquidsoap. So there's a couple of key, like sort of amazing pieces of software that can make something like that really scalable. I appreciate you guys raising your hands, but just as a reminder, we are only accepting raised hands from folks who have gone through the server verification process. But thank you though. Yeah, Radio France also does a bunch of really crazy things. Like they have 2 source machines that end up like crossing over to 2 different listener machines, like machines that listeners can actually tune into. But for each of the source machines, they have a main line and they have a backup line. And then in addition to all of this, they have 2 satellite-based backups. Like they have massive, like otherworldly sort of system that just makes sure that their stuff is always on and always running. We at Gensokyo Radio are not quite so fortunate to be able to run a system that's that robust, but yeah, it's pretty neat to see what like a national scale broadcaster uses for some of that stuff. Cool. All right. So if there aren't any members that are interested or want to ask a question, that's fine. Thank you everyone who tuned in this afternoon or whatever time it is in your part of the world. This has been Gensokyo Radio, how to run an internet radio station, a most decidedly more technical talk about some of the things that we run on sort of in the background, behind the curtain. This is sort of your look into what some of that is. And hopefully through this, you were able to glean some information about where you might be able to get started if you're interested in running an internet radio station. And aside from all of that, I think for me, just researching this topic, it was interesting learning more about some of the history, some of its growth over time, and some of the current trends that are out there. Knowing that internet radio is still a very much utilized medium is comforting to me as a radio station operator. So that's always good to know. But yeah, so that's where I'm going to leave it there. Thank you everyone for tuning in this afternoon. I am Lunar. That's Nano over there. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to Discord once again for giving us the opportunity to do these events. It's been pretty fun. We'll talk to you all in our Discord server, or we've also got another live show that's coming up, probably not this weekend, but the weekend after, so that'd be August 21st, the same time, same place. So that's that. All right, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk to you in the next time. Till then.